To zoom out on the EU global strategy from the perspective of an NGO entirely depends on who you are, of course. I will assume, just to take one example out of many, but one which is important for me, that you are an NGO focusing on freedom inside and outside the EU, but you have a global agenda. There are of course many other NGOs focusing on climate change, corruption, etc. This takes us one step towards defining the perspective that we need for this presentation. Secondly, I will assume that you're not an anarchist. That is, that you are focusing on the rule of law while talking about the rights and protection of people inside societies and the rights of people to move freely. I will assume that you are very focused on the freedom of the media, for instance. At the same time, I assume that you are setting limits in terms of freedom, particularly for those who have, in various ways, versus those who have nots, the have-nots. All of this means, in essence, that I assume that you support the agenda of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, nowadays called the OSCE. As you may remember, this organization provided much moral support to freedom fighters in countries such as Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, Poland, Lech Wałęsa during the Cold War. It was perhaps not intentional. Many of those signing up to the Helsinki Final Act didn't see the impact of that document at the time. At least not in this way. I should mention that I'm a member of the NGO network in Sweden, which is working from an OSCE perspective. In my case, just to take one example, I'm doing work on trafficking, and you can follow some of my work on trafficking on my website and on the website of the OSCE network in Sweden. I will provide a link to that. So that's already a wide agenda involving trafficking in human beings, migrant smuggling, drugs, weapons, etc. Now, you may ask who I am to be telling you all about these things. Well, this is me. I'm a strange combination, perhaps. On the one hand, I'm a former EU ambassador and a former Swedish diplomat. So I've been on the governmental side, on the EU side, but I've also worked as an NGO, at least before I joined services and working as a peace researcher, and then after leaving active service. During my period of being in official functions, 15 years working for the EU from 1960 to 2011, I've met countless NGO representatives doing marvelous work, not least in the margin of summits and ministerial meetings, trying to lobby the organization. The same was true, by the way, when I was working for the Swedish OSCE chairmanship in the early 90s, when I met many people who were not yet in government, who later became very prominent in their new positions as leaders of newly independent countries. So this is a frame of reference that I have, that you may have. It's not an unbiased perspective. It would be, of course, pretentious of me but at least you may be able to generate some ideas on your own following this presentation. I hope that. At least you can react to what I'm saying, can't you? And if you're working inside structures and for member states of the EU, or for the matter of the EU itself, or the OSCE, or other actors, this briefing may make you more perceptive about the role and importance of NGO work inside and outside the EU, because I really think it's essential. In a sense, I'm going to make some NGO unhappy, because I'm not going into the populist agenda here. There's no real discussion of populism as it now is being discussed in the EU. It will be coming up in other briefings that I'm doing on the strategy and on other things relating to EN security. To a large extent, it has to do with the fact that, and this is my personal view, that populism is not so much an issue of criticizing power, but of acquiring power, of using populist agendas to get power yourself or for your ideas. But let me now go back to the purpose of the e-learning light program that I'm pursuing. It is easy to get lost in it because it's a topic which might interest you when you're talking human rights. But should an NGO activist engage on the European Union global strategy? This is a valid question, because in truth, we haven't seen much of that on the level of strategy after the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was a lot of general discussions on values and topics of that kind. Civil rights movements in countries such as Belarus have of course received a lot of support, and some of this has of course also been financed by the EU. But on the more general level, what strength does and what support does the European Union discourse add to the human rights agenda? When we look at the European Union security strategy from 2003, for instance, it's certainly not best known for its focus on freedom. Keywords in that strategy included above all weapons of mass destruction and terrorism and things like that. This was a period of the Iraq War, if you remember, as it started. And however, and this is contrary to my argument now, the 2003 strategy actually started a debate, also from an NGO perspective, from a perspective of people in the European Parliament and so on. What am I getting at here? Well, I'm getting at the fact that the war against terrorism during the Bush Jr. period to a large extent was linked to the notion of regime change. For the American official perspective, this was a discussion linked to countries such as Iraq. But this has also become, for some time, has been for some time, an NGO perspective. Associated, for instance, with hopes for the future, notably after the Arab Spring. This is a delicate topic because it has to do with the mantra of supporting governments elected democratically, and relationship in turn to the question to what to do when elections may have been democratic to start with, but governments have then later used the situation to create something which is less democratic, which we know already from before the Second World War. Or when an election may have been formally correct, but carried out in a situation which has not made it possible for people to put their votes in the way they wanted to. It also has to do with the notion that early elections are good in themselves, as we have seen in the debate about Afghanistan. It's a contentious notion. So there are many and complex questions here about what is right and wrong when it comes to regime change and the support to governments. And the question is, what does the European Union global strategy say about this? Is there a clear message here, or is there not? A second topic, which is very traumatic in the debates, not least in the European Parliament, is what the war on terrorism, or the fight against terrorism, which is the EU term, has meant for freedom and the rule of law. Are governments using the fight against terrorism as a pretext to attack the opposition in their countries and abroad? Let's look at that issue again in perspective of what the global strategy says on different issues of relevance to this. We know some of the reactions to the strategy so far, and there haven't been so many, but there have been some. There were very many seminars organized during the public consultation phase, but then came Brexit and put a lid on the debate and on the public attention to the strategy. The media certainly didn't focus on the European global strategy when Brexit was on top of the agenda during the summer. And there is worry expressed in some of the global strategy seminars that this hasn't really been debated in the member states. Those who have commented, however, has noted a certain shift in the emphasis of the strategy from a focus on democracy and freedom towards more of a focus on the resilience of societies in a challenging world. And people who have done this comment, have made this comment, have done it from the perspective of the notion of resilience as something as sort of a robust society. Let's therefore look a little bit more closely at this concept of resilience as it is used in the strategy. What does it say in relation to the concept of freedom? And as we will come back to, Turkey is a good case in point. It's a good case in point when discussing the dilemmas facing Europe, and not least NGOs, when discussing what is right and what is wrong in terms of freedom and the protection of human security in the current situation of Turkey after the coup. What guidance does the European Union global strategy give in such a complex situation? There are many links here to specific issues and concerns, including, for instance, the death penalty, the media freedom issue, and the rule of law in general. There is an important link to migration and to the agreement between the EU and Turkey on migration. Does the strategy say anything meaningful about what the EU should do in such a situation? Or does it only enumerate different goals without really putting them into any sort of hierarchy, making clear what is more important and what is less important? This is, of course, a wider issue, because it links up with the question of how to react to the situation not only in Turkey, but for instance in Egypt, in other Arab countries. We may remember that the hopeful slogan of the Arab Spring has now turned into a more neutral term, the Arab uprisings, because we are not really sure what to think about them. And then what about Syria? Is regime change in Syria more important than fighting ISIS? Can one do both? And can one fight dictatorships in Syria and elsewhere without losing the support of vital NGOs, such as Physicians Without Borders? Is it possible, for instance, when we are talking CSDP, defense, for the EU to be associated with coercive military activities, while at the same time catering for democracy, human rights and the rule of law? Not easy questions. And another topical issue. Is it a good thing that the EU tries to equip other actors, such as the African Union, to do militarily what the EU cannot do? Even using EU development aid for this. This is a topic which in itself requires a lot of slow thinking, to say the least. The term for this, rather bureaucratic in the EU, is capacity building for security and development, CBSD. And what does all of this mean in relation to the well-known mantra of more and more and less for less? That is a notion of conditionality. Well, as you see, I have a difficulty to control myself. Questions seem to be popping up all the time. So I think it's time for us to make a break here before going into the strategy document. Hopefully that will not be so boring for you now as it would have been if we had gone straight into the text.